Shalom, Akim, Shalom, Shalom, giving all praises, glory, and honor to Yahweh, Ba'ashem Yahushai, Ba'ashem Rakakwadash, double honors to the apostles and the elders of Great Millstone, teaching us his truth and salutations to the sincere Akim and Aquatim. Listen, may the blessing of election be upon your house. My name is Raquai, and back in here with another quick on Lord's will, is always an edifying lesson. And for today's lesson, I wanted to go through, this idea of the Israelite man and his value, and essentially how the way things are going in the world with certain key events. These other nations, especially their women, are noticing that the Israelite man is very well sought after, right? And that's really how that shows the Israelite man is really the one that's very superior, right? And it's so important for us as well to actually still conduct ourselves in such in a certain way, that actually confounds the ways that Esau has essentially tarnished and tampered with the Israelite man's image. Because if there's anything Esau has always had the power to do, it's basically to tarnish that image, right? So that's why it's in doing some reflection in regards to some of my even personal experiences, and also even understanding the way certain events are going, and moving around in this society as well, realizing that there are certain things that are occurring, where the Israelite man, especially the so-called black man, is very well sought after within these other nations, and then their other their other in these other countries, right? So we're realizing there's also a shift in going what's occurring, where they are not seen as the way Esau has portrayed us to be essentially a animalistic pit bull that cannot be controlled, because Esau is really about making us essentially a threat, right? Because he knows that he is not as capable and as strong, as well endowed, as powerful as as the Israelite man, right? Starting with that starting with that image, that so-called black man image, right? Because they understand that they're inferior people, right? So what they have to do is they have to compete in another arena to essentially, because he's all about deception. He's all about making himself look good. What he will do, using his media platforms, is to essentially tarnish the image of the Israelite man. That's why the prophets are so important in regards to telling our people, especially our men, to actually turn back to the Lord, right? Because then you start to actually conform the ways the Most High actually wants us to be, right? It helps you to actually cultivates you in back into understanding that you're still a noble vine and not a degenerate plant, right? So I kind of wanted to floor around with this idea, in regards to the value of the Israelite man. This is a bit of an exhortation, but it's still a very interesting times that we're living in, where these women are actually seeking after the so-called, like, the Israelite man, right? Especially the so-called black man, right? So I wanted to go and I wanted to read this real quick. Excuse me. I'll go back into the beginning, right? So this is Genesis chapter 25, verse 23, and it says, "And the Lord Yahweh said unto her, two nations are in thy womb, and two manner of people shall be separated from thy bowels, and one people shall be stronger than the other, and the elder shall serve the younger. And when her days to be delivered were fulfilled, behold, there were twins in her womb." So essentially, there was a wrestling in her womb but you had two different diverse groups of people within Rebecca. I believe this is Rebecca, right? Right, Rebecca, right? Fighting in her womb, right? Two different manners of people, right? So you had one that was actually created to be righteous, and you had one that was created to be the wicked, right? So this is verse 25, and it says, "And the first came out red all over like a hairy garment, and they called his name Esau, right? And Esau would eventually become known as the father of the Edomites, right? This is verse 26, and it came the other, and after that his brother came out, and his hand took hold of Esau's heel, and his name was called Jacob, right? And Isaac was 80 years old when she had bare them, right? So essentially, this is the type. Oh, as a matter of fact, let me read verse 27. Um, and the boys grew, and Esau was a cunning hunter and the man of the field, and Jacob was a plain man dwelling in tents. So let me get that word plain real quick to show you the type of person um, uh, uh, 1 second. Jacob was. Okay, so you have here the word for plain is in the Hebrew, it's H8552. It says thamam, right? And it says to be complete. It says um 1 second. To be complete, to be sound, unimpaired, to be upright ethically. It says to finish, complete, perfect. It says to make a sound, to oh, look at this, to deal in integrity and act uprightly, right? So this is how Jacob was created to be, and Jacob would essentially, his name would be changed to Israel, and he would beget 12 sons, right? So this is very, very important because this is how we're actually created, and this is how we're supposed to be, right? But what Esau will do, you know, especially during the Renaissance period, and even up until the 60s and 1970s, what Esau has done is gone through a major slander campaign in tarnishing the image of you so-called Israelites, of you Israelites, I should say, if you so-called Negroes, Latinos, Native Americans, in making sure that you don't actually look like this definition that I just read here as an upright and upstanding, ethically, person that actually has integrity. What he has done is basically posing himself, to be the people, right? And actually shown himself that, he is so-called righteous, right? So, you know, I wanted to, discuss this real quick because, it's so important, for, our minds mentally, as well as to see the shift of what's going on and things going back into the way things were, where we were actually dealing with the other nations, but at the same time we're dealing with them, having an understanding of who we are as a whole, and being essentially a chaste, as Paul describes, we're supposed to be chaste, and I've espoused you to one husband, right? In dealing with them in actual righteousness, because this knowledge and understanding is supposed to be a beacon of light of how to actually conduct ourselves, right? So let's go here. Oh, I wanted to get this in Sirach because I mentioned about the fear and the uprightness. Let me see if I can find that. I know the word glorious is in there. Okay, this is Sirach chapter 27, verse 8. And it says, if thou followest righteousness, thou shalt obtain her and put her on as a glorious robe, right? Because that's what these wisdom is supposed to do. And wisdom, one of the core elements of wisdom is to actually fear the Lord first, right? It's supposed to be a crown of glory onto our heads, and all the nations are supposed to look at us as, okay, this is a wise and understanding people, and people will pick up on that vibration when you act in accordance with Yahweh Bashem Yahushai. This is Sirach chapter 1, verse 18, and it says, the fear of the Lord is a crown of wisdom, making peace and perfect health to flourish. Both are both which are the gifts of the Most High, and enlargeth their rejoicing that love him. Wisdom raineth down skill and knowledge of understanding, and exalted them to honor that hold her fast. Right? So there is a certain type of reverence and conduct, that it produces, when you're in accordance with Yahweh Bashim Yahushai, right? And this is something that it was not given, to the other nations. That's why it's so important that you Israelites, especially, you know, the men, who do not know of their own history, is to actually know of your own history, because it realized when you applied the understanding of our that essentially that uprightness, you realize that a lot of our forefathers were elevated into certain positions, and the other nations looked at them they looked at them as very well sought after. They were seeking after their counsel, after their, what they wanted to know, because they realized that this man is a very valuable individual because he acts in accordance with Heavenly Father, right? So, as a matter of fact, um, let's get verse 9. Let me get an example of that. This is Second Chronicles 9. I'll start off verse 1, and I'm going to read down to 4. And it says, I'll read it in the AMP. And it says, when the queen of Sheba heard of the fame of Solomon, she came to Jerusalem to test Solomon with riddles. She was accompanied by a very large number of attendants with camels bearing spices, and large amounts of gold and precious stones. And when she had came to Solomon, she talked with him about all that, that was on her mind. And Solomon answered all her questions. Nothing was hidden from him, which he did not make clear unto to her. And when the queen of Sheba saw the depth of Solomon's wisdom, right? Because that's what makes us glorious. That's what makes us actually appealing, you know, as an Israelite man, because the scriptures say that wisdom maketh a man's face to shine, right? So here it says, and so when the queen of Sheba saw the depth of Solomon's wisdom, and the house that he had built, and the food on his table, and vast seating order of his officials, the attendants and service of the ministers, and their attire, his cupbearers and their attire, and their stairway by which he went up to the house of the Lord, she was breathless. So she said to the king, the report which I have heard in my own land regarding your accomplishments and your words and your wisdom was true. But I did not believe the reports until I had came and saw it with my own eyes. Behold, half of thy greatness of your wisdom was not told to me. I have surpassed the report that I have heard. Right. So, she heard the reports of all, of Solomon's accomplishments, and she was essentially She was basically like flabbergasted. She had a jaw-dropping moment, because she saw the arrangement of really she saw the manifestation of Solomon's wisdom. And this is one of the things when you go back to Kings in the the third chapter, I'm not mistaken. In the third chapter, Solomon clearly said, Lord, I am but a child, right? So, and also him exemplifying that level of humility as well, but the point really is that when he prayed for wisdom, right, and then wisdom essentially elevated him and decked him out, right? So you're starting to see, so what we're seeing here, in this account is essentially the physical manifestation of that wisdom, right? And this is how we're supposed to look as Israelite men. This is why we're so well sought after and valuable, because the Lord gave us skill and cunning and knowledge, right? And the Lord only chose us to be a special people, right? You only have I known, right? But the Lord is punishing a bunch of our people because they don't act in accordance with wisdom in the way the Lord actually instructed them to be, right? They rather be stubborn children. And what happens to stubborn children when you read the law? What happens to them? They get taken out to the elders and then they get stoned, right? So, and this is happening on a mass scale, or essentially it's Esau doing that stoning, right? He's offing a lot of our people, through these different methods, whether it might be ice or whether through be deportation, prisons, and so on and so forth, right? But it shows you the importance. The scriptures say that wisdom prevented them that desire her, right? So that desire wisdom, you get prevented from a lot of these situations too. That's another aspect of wisdom. It gives you the understanding to be subtle, right? So understanding the importance of wisdom, and that essentially serves as something that decks us out, right? It decks us out in the spirit, I'll say it like that. But that also does manifest physically as well, right? And this is something that that is very interesting, that is occurring with this phenomenon of a lot of these other nations desiring Jake, desiring you Israelite men, the Israelite man, because he's the top species, right? He's the one that's actually well sought after. And that's why it's so important, going back to conduct and character and so on and so forth, to reverence yourself, to conduct yourself as such. Because one thing I've noticed through experience is that you fearing the Lord is basically like a glitch in the matrix. Because when you interact with people, on a worldly level, they understand, you know, they might look at you and you might conduct yourself in a certain way, that essentially disrupts the stronghold that might be in their minds. Because, say, for example, if you look like a so-called, black man, for example, you conducting yourself in a certain way is a glitch in the matrix, because they don't expect you to be somebody who's very well-rounded in terms of intelligence. They don't expect you to be wilding out or crashing out, on the job. They don't expect they expect you, I should say, to do those things. They expect you to be, very overly emotional. They expect you to be, a thug or a gangster or something like that. They expect very negative. They have very negative perceptions of you. That's why it's so important that conduct and that reverence for Yahweh Bashimasha is so important, because it grooms us to actually be in that noble state of how we supposed to be, right? Right. And then this is our wisdom, as it says as a matter of fact, let me get that. And the Lord is giving us back that, wisdom, right? um Let me get that in Deuteronomy. This is Deuteronomy chapter 4, verse 5, and it says, "Behold, I have taught you statutes and judgments, even as the Lord my power commanded me, that ye shall do so in the land whither ye go to possess it." Verse 6, "Keep therefore and do them, for this is your wisdom and your understanding in the sight of the nations, which shall hear these statutes, and surely and say, surely this great nation is a wise and understanding people. For what nation is there so great that the Most High Yahweh so nigh unto them as the Lord Yahweh Bashim Shai, our power in all things that we call upon him for? And what nation is there so great that has statutes and judgments so righteous as all this law which I set before you this day? So only take heed to thyself and keep thy soul diligently, lest forget the things which thy eyes have seen, and lest they depart from thy hearts all the days of thy life, but teach to them to thy sons and thy sons' sons. So this is really an inheritance, right? Because our children are supposed to understand these things. They're not supposed to understand, the alphabet lifestyle when they go into these public indoctrination camps known as schools. They're not supposed to understand those things. They're supposed to understand their own history. That's why it says in Job to inquire and search, the ways of your fathers, right? Because that's really who does begetting of the seed, right? It's the man that begets the seeds. That's why I went back to the account, starting with Jacob, because there were two nations in thy womb, separated at birth, right? But one people was stronger than the other, right? So that's, and when your children know this and armed with this information, they conduct themselves accordingly. They don't behave in the ways of they clone Tyrones, or they clone Kamisha and stuff like that. They don't behave like princes. They don't behave like thugs and hoes and stuff like that. When you're armed with your history, you act essentially more accordingly of how to exemplify the forefathers that came before you, right? But Esau, remember, and and that's another aspect of it too. When you're armed with when you know your history, you understand who the enemy is, and you understand how your enemy fights, right? So there's really nothing that Esau can do. He might slander, he might toss some of us in prison, but he might try and persecute us. But these things, when you understand these things, like there are certain things that Esau can't do, because he's just somebody who's a carnal man. He's a base man, right? He would try and do those things, right? Just like how those elders were trying to do slanderous things towards Susanna, right? But Susanna was a woman that feared the Lord, right? So we're also the Lord's woman as well, right? So, you know, remember, we're precious individuals, man. And Lord's will, the Lord has mercy upon us, right? So I'll get this last one here. This is Ecclesiastes 8 and 1, and it says, who is as a wise man and knoweth the interpretation of a thing? A man's wisdom maketh his face to shine, and his boldness of his face shall be changed, right? So, this is the way a man looks, more desirable in the eyes of the Lord, right? So, and that's the Israelite man, right? So, these other nations are picking up that vibration, right? When we conduct ourselves in a certain way of reverence, right? And the Lord is giving us that, that wisdom back, right? So we can actually be able to, conduct ourselves and walk in that, you know, that manner of royalty, because the scriptures say a man should be known by his walk, right? So, um, I'll leave the lesson there. I might do a part 2 to this, but hopefully this lesson was edifying. Just like to give all praises, glory, and honor to Yahweh Bashim Shai. Until next time, I say Shalom.